Britain, the US and France may be complicit in war crimes in Yemen. That's according to a new United Nations report. Iran is also being implicated. The UN says the Saudi-led coalition's use of starvation as a tactic may also amount to a war crime. Investigators say the crimes shouldn't go unpunished, and they've given a list of suspects to the UN rights chief. Let's listen in now to a live UN news conference taking place in Geneva.
Citizens have been immense and varied. The bombing, the airstrikes, the snipers, they hit the people in their daily lives, often without warning, in areas where there is not active combat taking place. This gives the impression that there is no place that is safe, there is no place to hide. The mines left by the Houthi kill and mutilate people for a great deal of time after the end of combat. The blockade, siege-like tactics, attacks against objects that are essential to the survival of the population, and the restrictions to the provision of humanitarian aid deny the population the food, the water, and the medication that they need at a moment when Yemen is undergoing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. More than 24 million people, more or less 80% of the population of Yemen, depend on humanitarian aid to survive. People continue to be subjected to arbitrary detention, they are arbitrarily stopped, they are disappeared, and they are subjected to torture. They are subjected to ill treatment, and they're also subjected to sexual violence. And in some cases, documented by the group of experts, they have died in the custody of the parties to the conflict or shortly after being released. The population fears being stopped or targeted for having shown their dissidence. The parties are actively recruiting, all parties are actively recruiting children, and this includes forcible recruitment. The parties to the conflict are hassling and threatening activists, journalists, human rights defenders, humanitarian workers. They impose upon them restrictions in their work. This often leads to the interruption of services provided to people in need. All of these acts are violations of the rights of the Yemenis population. Many of these are also war crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, the proof is overwhelming. 5 years have gone by. Impunity is ever more anchored. Violence worsens day to day. It is essential that we afford a great deal of priority to the needs of the civilians. We wish to underscore that the suffering of Yemeni civilians represents a collective failure by the parties to the conflict and the international community. Hence, the parties to the conflict and the international community bear the collective responsibility of resolving this conflict.
In line with our mandate, we can only communicate a list at confidential level. We cannot.
The latest thinking there from UN headquarters in Geneva in Switzerland, really boiling down a long period of research where they've collated various aspects of the aftermath of what's been going on in Yemen in its current form, certainly since 2015, when the conflict escalated into a fully fledged war. Let's talk now, as we stay with these pictures, to Noha Aboueldahab. She's joining us here in Doha. She's a fellow at the Brookings Doha Center and a specialist in transnational justice in the Arab region. Noha, welcome back to the NewsHour. Is the UN getting a little bit ahead of itself talking about Yemen in terms of accountability, i.e. nobody's being held to account?
Well, it's part of their mandate, right, to try and identify, first of all, the violations and crimes, human rights crimes and humanitarian law crimes, and it's part of their mandate to identify wherever possible, those responsible for such violations. So in terms of developing this list, as we just heard, of potential perpetrators, it's perfectly within the mandate of this group of eminent experts.
Do you have any idea who or which organizations may be on that list?
It's difficult. It's very difficult to say. I mean, what's interesting is I believe that the UK and the US and France have been specifically mentioned, or will be mentioned in this report, as complicit in some of the war crimes in Yemen. So it would be very interesting to see if there are individuals from those countries that are mentioned in that list.
And that comes down to the arms trade, one assumes.
I would imagine so. I mean, we've seen in previous reports, previous UN reports specifically calling on countries who continue to sell their arms to the Saudi-led coalition to stop doing so because of the risk that those arms are being used in crimes committed in the war. And indeed, we've seen other reports that have verified that these weapons from these countries have been used in those crimes.
Is the conflict itself going to get worse before it gets better? Because over the past, 3 weeks now, we've been talking about what the separatists have been doing in the southern half of Yemen, offset against the reality, which is the UAE forces seem to be distancing themselves just a little bit from the Saudi-led coalition in terms of what's going on in other parts of the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conflict in Yemen is at a very critical juncture right now. We've, heard a lot of talk about, is there a major rift between the Saudis and the Emiratis, given the attacks in Aden, the Emirati strikes in Aden last Thursday, for example. But I think in terms of the UAE's role in the south, I think it's important to view it within the wider context, right? I mean, the UAE is not just supporting the Southern Transitional Council as a secessionist movement. Its support for the STC is very much regarded as a gateway for the UAE's control of essential waterways and resources in this very strategic geographical area in Yemen. And so I think that the war has gotten a lot worse. I hope that it doesn't get even worse. But going back to the UN report, these reports, while they may not necessarily lead to an immediate or concrete action with regards to accountability and resolving the war, they do still serve a very important purpose in the sense that they're this constant reminder in the midst of this mess of the multiple and complex layers of the conflict in Yemen that there's vast death and destruction happening in Yemen, and they're very strong ammunition for NGOs and governments and the very few conscientious politicians who continue to call for an end to the conflict and for accountability.
OK, the UN Special Envoy, Martin Griffiths, not there in Geneva today. We're not quite sure why, of course, but can he do more than he's done, or might he, say, like Staffan de Mistura to do with Syria, actually have to say, I've done the best I can do and hand that baton on to somebody else? What else can be done?
Yes, I mean, the UN Special Envoy, Martin Griffiths, is obviously in a very difficult position as he tries to mediate. I think that his statement calling on the Saudi-led coalition to investigate the Damar attack against the detention facility earlier this week was a little bit disappointing in the sense that in the past, the Saudi coalition has investigated such incidents, and basically always the conclusion is it was a mistake or it was perfectly legitimate. So I think that perhaps the UN Special Envoy could go a little bit further, especially in light of these reports that keep coming out, whether it's from the group of eminent experts or others, to call for stronger accountability measures.